Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us for Messaging the Truth about Election Processes. This session will address lessons learned from voting during a pandemic and how the big lie set the stage for the most aggressive attack on the freedom to vote that we've seen in modern times. It's my pleasure to introduce Joseph NEWMAN, Communications Manager for Voting Rights at ReThink. Joe works with organizations in the democracy movement, like the League, to develop communication strategies focused on protecting, strengthening, and expanding voting rights. He helps ReThink's partners respond rapidly to breaking events and trains them in best practices for getting their messages out to the media, policymakers, and the public. Prior to joining ReThink, Joe served as the Director of Communications for Project on Government Oversight, an independent watchdog that investigates corruption in the federal government and champions good government reforms. Before that, he was Deputy Director of Communications at Public Citizen, a nonprofit progressive advocacy organization. He started his career in Florida, where he was an award-winning reporter and editor at the Orlando Sentinel, St. Petersburg Times, and the Palm Beach Post. Joe holds a BS in journalism and communications from the University of Florida. After Joe's presentation, like in the main session, we will be able to have a little Q&A. If you have questions while Joe is presenting, please place your questions in the chat, and so we can get those to Joe later in this 45-minute session. You'll find the chat in the toolbar at the bottom of your screen if you have not used it before. Welcome, Joe. Thank you for joining us for this discussion of how the events of the past year have impacted and shaped how we message around voting rights, as well as a look at what we can expect moving forward.
Thank you, Deb. Thank you very much. Do I have the ability to share my screen? Let me try.
You should have it.
All right. Whoops, that's not what I want you to see. Okay, so let me just bear with me for a second here. And okay, do you see my notes or do you see the last slide?
We see your question slide. Yep, there you go.
Yep. Okay, but you don't see my notes.
We do not.
Okay, sorry about this, folks. I should have had that queued up from the beginning. Thank you so much for having me here. I definitely love the opportunity to speak about voting rights whenever I can. But and thank you, Deb, for helping organize this. I really want to thank you folks for showing up this morning. I mean, this is a difficult time to be doing what we're doing, but it's incredibly important work. And, you know, we need to be doing this work, and I know it can be tough. And that's why I really appreciate everyone in this room. So today we're going to be talking about messaging around our freedom to vote. That's what I do for a living. I help groups communicate. It's going to be a little interactive. So I've got chat up. I just want to make sure everyone knows how to use chat, and let's get a little warm up. If you could just drop your name and where you're viewing from in chat, I'd love to see that. And also, I've been to Milwaukee before. It's been years, like 20, 30 years. If I visit Wisconsin, what's the one place that I should go, that I should put on my to-do list? So drop that in chat. I see a lot of people doing that. Thank you so much. Thank you. All right, let's get started. So we're going to start with a brief look at the opposition frame. This is the narrative that they've been using rather successfully to create barriers to the ballot box. Then we'll get into the nuts and bolts of how to craft an effective message. We'll take a look at the way we talk about voting rights and how that has changed just over the last year. And finally, we'll dive into some practice on how to deliver our message. That is, how to tell our story, or better put, how to tell our story in a way that resonates with the audience we're trying to reach. So over the last 2 years, we've seen a really unprecedented attack on our freedom to vote. The opposition's main messaging frame, and really it's their only frame, is voter fraud. You know, when the opposition uses the voting fraud frame, they're trying to build a storyline aimed at trying to show how voter fraud is a real threat and threatens the integrity of our election. And they do this because it provides them a reason to support policies that create deliberate barriers to voting. You know, we know this. This is not just us guessing. We know this is their justification, because Donald Trump himself said in 2020, he said the quiet part out loud. Remember last year, near the beginning of the pandemic, the Dems were trying to unsuccessfully get more money in the stimulus package for vote by mail. After that failed, Trump told Fox and Friends, quote, "They had levels of voting that if you ever agreed to it, you'd never have a Republican elected in this country again." So we know the motivation on a lot of this. What's happened is, after the unprecedented attack on vote by mail, and then when the election came, the messaging that this election was fraudulent and not legitimate, it spurred a wave of legislation in the states. Okay, we've seen to date 19 legislatures around the country that have enacted anti-voter laws. 7 of these states have enacted more stringent voter ID requirements. 3 states have reduced polling place locations. 3 states have limited early voting days and hours. And 4 states have limited the number of drop-off locations. And that's just some of the lowlights that the Brennan Center, I want to quote the source there, the Brennan Center has tracked very, very effectively over the last year. So how do we push back against the opposition frame of voter fraud? The short answer is we don't. You know, and it's more complicated than that, but we can't fight them on their terms. We simply don't win when we try to push back against the voter fraud frame. When we say that voter fraud is not significant or consequential, it doesn't resonate with audiences, and for a couple key reasons. We can't say that voter fraud doesn't exist, because it does. Every election, there's someone somewhere who gets charged with trying to vote fraudulently. Most people can't conceptualize how many of these cases of voter fraud it would take to actually impact the outcome of an election. You know, once they believe that even one case of quote unquote real voter fraud exists, when we say that voter fraud isn't significant, or we try to deny voter fraud has an impact on elections, that message tends to fall flat. So when we try to frame voter fraud as being a non-issue, we're also forced to repeat the opposition's language. So when we use the words voter fraud in our rebuttals, you know, we're unintentionally reinforcing their message. So that's a predicament, because that's all they talk about, right? The opposition only talks about voter fraud. Instead, we need to change the conversation. We need to talk about the things that we want to talk about. We want to talk about our solutions. You know, we use this in analogy of voting, of how people view voting. Most people see voting as an individual act, right? They're that single tree in the forest. In the minds of a lot of voters, if other people don't vote, it's because they're not motivated, they're not informed, they don't care, or they're just lazy, right? Voting's easy for me. Why are other people having problems? So they see it as this individual act. They don't think about barriers to voting because they're not experiencing those. So as advocates, we want to help people see the entire forest. We want to help them see the system. We need to reframe the conversation about voting so that it focuses on the system, to show how rules are different from state to state and not equal for everyone. We want to help people see how difficult it is for that single parent who's working 2 jobs to get to the polling place before 7 p.m. We need to show that the system, that making the system more accessible helps them not only as an individual, but it helps our everyday heroes, our seniors, our parents, our military families. These are the people we need to get into our stories. Changing people's perspective about the impacts of the system, allows them to see both the problem and the solution. So we do this through our messaging. I'm going to talk a little bit about what goes into an effective message. 6 points I've put up here. You can all read them. And also, you don't worry about taking notes. You can for sure take notes, but I will provide a PDF of this deck to Deb, and she can get that out to whoever wants a copy. Audience, right? This is the first thing we need to understand. Who are we trying to reach? Who is our target audience? Who are the people who are going to help us achieve our goals? And in our messaging that we craft, our messaging is mostly to our base or to people we consider persuadables, right? We don't spend a lot of energy or time trying to message to the opposite side or to the opposing side. It's just not worth the effort, and we're not going to change a lot of those minds. But we do need to activate and motivate our base, and need to change the minds or persuade the people who are on the fence or could come to our side. We want to lead with values. Okay, what are our shared values? Freedom is an extremely successful frame for us. Having a voice, the promise of an inclusive democracy. These are things that are shared values, and our research shows that people across the political spectrum share these values. Name a villain. Okay, villains are people and things that are opposed to those values we just mentioned. Establishing a villain makes it easier for our audience to visualize the threat. We want to characterize the opposition as erecting barriers in order, they're trying to silence voices. We shouldn't shy away from the role of race in this equation either. Aspirational, what vision are we hoping to achieve? We want to articulate a message of what a better democracy looks like, where those shared values we just identified can thrive. Solutions, our messaging should point to effective solutions. What are the steps we need to take to achieve our vision? Whether that be legislation like the Freedom to Vote Act or the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act, or some of your local legislation in Wisconsin. We need to point to solutions, but we don't want to get bogged down into policy details, right? We don't want to talk about the specifics of these bills and legislation. We want to talk about what they're going to achieve, how they're going to help that single parent get to the polls and vote early or vote by mail, which leads into that last one, get personal. Messaging is more effective when our audience can relate to it. People don't relate to policy explanations. They do relate to those personal stories. Find those stories in your community, among your network, that humanize an issue, that make it real for people. So those are elements of crafting a message. Let's now talk about message discipline. This is extremely important, and we see how important it is because we see the other side's message discipline. All they do is talk about voter fraud, and that message gets through. That message is just, and Sarah mentioned this earlier about repetition. Repetition is important in messaging. And we know that message has landed very well because there was a poll just out this last week that said 35% of Americans, or 35% of voters, believe that the last presidential election should be overturned, right? 60% of those polled were that answered that way were Republicans. So we need to also maintain the same type of message discipline. I've talked about the other side and their success, but we should also look at the flip side of that equation. Our movement, the movement you're in and that you're powering, and the folks that I work with all across the country, we've been extremely effective at aligning our research, our messaging, and our advocacy. Several organizations and foundations have put a lot of coordinated resources into research and polling in the last year. And that's really been critical in helping us sharpen our messaging. At ReThink, my organization, we've revised and aligned all of our messaging with what our national partners have developed. The reason we do this is because it's extremely important for all of us to maintain that message discipline across the movement. In today's chaotic world, we need to remain focused and intentional with our message. The average voter spends less than 5 minutes a week thinking about all matters of public policy. So we've got a very small window to engage that audience. And that's just the sad truth. We need to be talking about what's relevant to achieve our goals and not get distracted, sidetracked, or stuck playing defense to the other side's arguments. One way to stay focused is developing and repeating over and over again your most effective talking points. Each one of you in this session should know what your talking points are. Write them down, practice them in front of the mirror. Whether you are a person that deals with the media or whether you're just talking to your neighbor, know what your talking points are. Doing that, repeating them over and over again. We work with people all the time who have to give media interviews. And it's like, okay, let's do this over and over again. And absolutely, it can feel restrictive, right? It feels like you're not being original. But mistakes happen when you try to veer off and be original. Stick with the talking points. And there's loads of research that shows continuous repetition is an important factor in persuading audiences. Message discipline and repetition is critical. Let me say that again. Message discipline and repetition is critical. Now, these are talking points. These are not even my slides. I borrowed these slides from the national partners that I talked about, I mentioned, who have helped develop some of these talking points. And I'm sharing the slides because these are the ones that we're going to push to everybody. These may be different than what ReThink had 2 years ago, but now we want to all be on the same page. So I'm going to read these. For democracy to work for all of us, it must include all of us. Voters pick our leaders. Leaders do not get to pick and choose their voters. No matter our color, party, or zip code, we will all want an equal say in the decisions that shape our future. The For the People Act, the Voting Rights Advancement Act, guarantees everyone the freedom to vote, no exceptions. The For the People Act / the Voting Rights Advancement Act will bring down the barriers erected to silence Black, Indigenous, young, and new Americans and ensure equal voice in the decisions that impact our lives. The For the People Act prevents billionaires from buying our elections and enables everyday voters to have an equal say in our government. Just as we fought throughout our history for our freedom to vote, we are coming together today to ensure Americans are able to cast our vote and have it counted. Coming together to pass the For the People and Voting Rights Advancement Acts, we can ensure all of us, no matter our color, zip code, or income, have an equal say in our democracy. Together, we can elect leaders who govern in our interests and make the promise of democracy real for all of us. So those are the national talking points that we've developed. And obviously, you can adapt those to Wisconsin. You can adapt those to the city that you live in or the town you live in, but try to kind of stay in that lane. And when people want to ask you about voting fraud, we pivot back to our talking points. We do a whole training on pivoting. I'm not going to do a lot of that today because we just don't have time. But one way to pivot is when someone asks you about that, you say, what we really should be talking about is, and then you go into your talking points. So I want to take a minute here to talk about some of the new recent research that has happened in the last year that has really changed the way we talk about our freedom to vote. It's actually, we used to give out a voter's guide at ReThink that we put together and spent a lot of money, our grants that we get from foundations. We put it into this voting guide, and I no longer hand that out because it's dated. It has in just this last year, things have changed in the way we talk about voting rights. So in fact, when we say voting rights nowadays, we really should be talking about freedom to vote, right? Voting rights is an abstract more abstract. People don't make an emotional connection to the term voting rights, not the same way they do when we talk about freedom. So you can still use voting rights for sure, depending on your audience, but when you're working on your messaging, it is better to be talking about our freedom to vote. Okay, so let's move to another one. Let's see. Voter suppression. That's something we all know what voter suppression is, and we're all working against voter suppression. What we found is that audiences across the political spectrum don't believe voter suppression is an issue. And this is not just people on the right. This is people in the middle and people on the left. They don't believe voter suppression is an issue. Remember what I said about people seeing voting as an individual act. And when they hear voter suppression, they think back to the time of Jim Crow, and they know that literacy tests and polling taxes no longer exist, or they've been outlawed. So they don't see the system. They don't see that the lack of polling places create these long lines, and that's an act of suppression. So we don't want to say that. What should we be saying? Anyone want to drop into chat other ways to talk about voter suppression? Just to keep us moving, we can talk about deliberate barriers to voting. We can talk about politicians trying to deny our freedom to vote. We can brand things anti-voter, access for all. That's a good phrase. We want to create access for all, but we're talking about people trying to prevent access for all when instead of saying the term voter suppression. Democracy reform. Okay, this is an interesting one, right? Because we have the name democracy in a lot of our national organizations, and this research that's come out in the last year has basically said don't use the phrase democracy reform. As painful as it is to accept the phrase democracy reform, it doesn't resonate with our base and our persuadables. In fact, the research shows that when people list their list of priorities for the country, democracy reform finishes last. We generally use the word reform to describe altering something undesirable rather than creating something good. And people want to think about, what are you going to do to make things better? They don't want to hear that their system's broken. It also, when people think about democracy and saying democracy reform, it also implies that, okay, we've already got the system that should be working for everyone, and it's not. So we want to talk about the promise of democracy. Let's see, let me go. We want to talk about the need for fair representation, or making the promise of democracy real for all of us. Election security integrity. This is another one that we used to use quite a bit at ReThink. We used to talk about election integrity. Now we try to avoid that phrase, right? What we found is that when we talk about the need for election security and integrity, it actually backfires on us, and it increases the support for anti-voter policies. So these are surveys that researchers have done when they poll focus groups and folks to put them through the different questions. We find out when the conversation turns to election security or election integrity, it can actually work against us. Instead, we want to talk about safe and accessible elections. We want to talk about creating a transparent process we can trust. Eligible voters, that's another one that I used to use quite a bit. What the research shows here is that when we qualify voter with a word like eligible, we're actually reinforcing a right-wing frame suggesting that there are ineligible voters who cast illegal ballots. Because our elections are conducted properly, people who are voting are eligible by definition. So we should simply call them voters or Americans. that is the preferred way to respond. So you see that there's been some really fundamental changes, things that, like I said, have made us really put our old voting guide aside, and really, it's been great. Having this type of research has been very important. So one of the most important things for us to remember when talking about our audience is we shouldn't get mired in the technical details of a policy debate. We mentioned that before. I know our arguments are fact-based and supported by data, but when we talk policy, we fail to connect with people. Our brains are not wired that way. Our brains are wired to respond to emotional appeals. We want to talk about outcomes, okay? We want to connect to kitchen table issues. What are the things that matter to our audience? Access to healthcare, jobs and economic security, safe neighborhoods, better schools. You vote for someone who's going to take care of these needs. You vote for someone who's going to fix your pothole. The more we remind people why they're voting and why it matters, the more effective our message is going to be. Let me give you an example here on how to do that. Protecting our freedom to vote means protecting our right to choose leaders who will put our needs above those of powerful corporate interests and wealthy donors, create jobs that pay a living wage, put science first when it comes to safeguarding our health. So connect our freedom to vote to outcomes. So let's take some of the message guidance that we've just gone over and see how it's delivered in real life situations. I'm going to play a video of Texas State Rep Nicole Collier. ReThink, we had the pleasure or the honor actually of helping all of the Texas Democrats who came to DC with their messaging and prepping them for interviews, and it was really one of the best experiences I've had in my 2 years at ReThink. But Nicole is one of those, and I'm going to play this video. It's only about 15 seconds long, but try to identify how many talking points she covers. Okay, so as you watch this, type into chat some of the words and phrases that jump out to you. Okay, now I've got chat up so I can monitor it, and let's see. Here's the video.
The Republicans have created barriers. They have filed bills that will create barriers to voting. We had one of the highest voter turnout rates in the last general election, and our former Republican appointed Secretary of State said those elections were smooth and secure. Let me tell you what's on the line. Your ability for free and fair elections are on the line. And what they are trying to do is to limit your voice.
Okay, I see some great responses in chat. Thank you. Right, exactly. These are good. So as some of you pointed out, one of the great things she did was she equated our vote to our voice. Using the voice metaphor is a very powerful tool because so many Americans all across the political spectrum use it naturally when they talk about voting, and we should lean into this whenever we get a chance. We should be talking in the language of our audience. So voice is I use it all the time. This is a part of your talking points. Voice. We all deserve a voice. We don't want to support laws that silence us. Things like that are great to use. So let me look at my time. We have some time to do this. I don't know if anyone here has played the word game Mad Libs. Confession, I've actually never played the real game Mad Libs. I guess it's maybe it's a board game or something like that. But we're going to do the ReThink version of it here. What I'm going to do is read some quotes from elected officials. These are real quotes talking about the wave of anti-voter bills that have been passed so far this year. These quotes are good, but I think we can probably make them better. Okay, so I'm going to read the quotes, and I want you to type into chat. You guys are doing great in chat, by the way. Thank you. Which words and phrases are good? Which ones are strong and effective? And then we'll start to identify the words and phrases that maybe we could tweak and improve. Okay, everybody got it? Okay, let's play the game. So here's the quote. All over the South in Republican states, we're seeing voter suppression bills. We need Congress to pass the Freedom to Vote Act and the John Lewis Voting Rights Act to make sure all Americans' rights to vote are protected. Okay, what's good in this quote? What should we keep? Go ahead and type it into to chat for me. Americans' rights to vote are protected. Good. Right. Okay. Freedom to Vote Act. John Lewis Voting Rights Act. We name the bills. We don't use bill numbers in our when we talk or when we message. Okay. That completely loses our audience right off the bat when we do that. So in this case, the Freedom to Vote Act it has our most powerful frame in it. So we always use the name of that bill. The John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act, pays homage to an American hero, a civil rights icon. So, tying this legislation to his legacy is a good thing. Don't ever use bill numbers. Okay, so the next part is, what are some of the words and phrases that we can maybe make a little stronger? Go ahead and type that into the chat box. Things that we could improve with this quote. Voter suppression bills, voter suppression. Okay, definitely voter suppression is we've gone over that. Rights to vote is a little bit awkward. I think we could probably improve that. Definitely voter suppression bills is something. And another thing in here is the phrase "we're seeing." Okay, it's a passive construction, a passive voice. So when we do that, we're missing a chance to name our villain. These things just don't happen, right? Who's passing these laws? Let's tell people who's responsible, right? We want them to visualize the threat. Okay, let's make it better. Here's the new quote. In state after state, Republican lawmakers are passing anti-voter laws and creating barriers to vote. We need Congress to pass the Freedom to Vote Act and the John Lewis Voting Rights Act to make sure all Americans' freedom to vote is protected. So what do we do here? We named the villain. We're branding these bills as anti-voter, and we talk about barriers to voting. I got time. Let's do another one. Okay, this quote is kind of a mess, but I'm going to read it. We've still got to work hard and make sure that people are just allowed to vote. We don't want to dredge up dead people and let them vote, and any of those other things that they claim that Democrats are trying to do. All right, anything good in this quote? Anything that that we should keep? Okay, I'll just make it easy for you. There's not much in this quote that we'd probably hang on to, but what parts of this quote aren't good? This is the easier part here. What are things that that we don't want to do? Go ahead and drop them in chat if you've got some ideas. Dredge up dead people. Okay, right, exactly. Okay, so talk about the opposition's frame. Okay, here's how we rewrite that quote. We've still got to work hard and make sure that people have their voices heard. We want a transparent process we can trust, where Americans have equal freedom to vote, no matter what we look like or where we live. Those are the talking points we talked about before. We don't want to repeat a negative. We don't want to go and play defense on the voter fraud messaging frame by talking about dead people voting. All things that we want to avoid. So let's move on. I want to leave a couple minutes for Q&A. Some scenarios that you might find yourself in if you work with the media or and host press conferences, or whether you're just going to talk to your neighborhood, people in your neighborhood. Here's a question you might be asked. Why are you talking about passing the Freedom to Vote Act? Isn't it dead in the Senate because of the filibuster? You know, you could be asked this by a neighbor for sure, right? We get asked this all the time, in fact, in the press. What we don't want to talk about when we're asked this is we don't want to repeat a negative, okay? Don't say the For the People Act isn't dead, okay? We want to avoid debates about procedure and legislative jargon. You know, we don't want to say we need a filibuster carve out for constitutional issues. If you have to speak about the filibuster, you know, what we do is we say that it's an antiquated congressional loophole, but we don't use the word filibuster. That does not land well with audiences at all. And we don't want to try to sell people on policy or technical aspects of legislation. We want to sell, you know, a good night's sleep, not the mattress. One way to answer that question is by framing it as part of the fabric of America. We don't give up. Here's a possible response. Throughout our history, we have fought to ensure Americans have the freedom to vote, that every American is able to cast their vote and have it counted. Our civil rights leaders didn't give up after one vote or two votes. They kept pushing forward to make the promise of democracy real for us all. And that's why we're here today. You know, it can be awful depressing to get too tied up into the whole procedural thing in the U.S. Senate when they filibuster these important pieces of legislation. But you know, I can tell you, we work inside these movements. We don't consider the Freedom to Vote Act dead, and we would never say that it's dead. So this is about continuing. This is about, you know, Martin Luther King Jr. did not give up because someone wrote a bad editorial, you know, or a bad op-ed. You know, that's not going to stop us. We're going to continue to fight. So that's the message that we should be giving. The other way is to put it in current context. You know, a handful of politicians want to take us backward, and in state after state, they're creating deliberate barriers to voting. They want to put up barriers and silence our voices, and they want this issue to go away. They don't want to talk about the Freedom to Vote Act because it has the support of the vast majority of Americans. But we won't be silenced. We are going to keep fighting. And I think that's another important point to remember in your messaging, is that the things that we're fighting for are very popular. Okay, that's the one thing we know, is that when you take partisan politics out of our polling and our survey, and you don't, you know, you just say what they do, people like our solutions. People want those solutions. You know, it's something we shouldn't run from. The last election, it was successful by all measure. It was successful. There were historic turnout across the country. Administrators, oh no, we're going to close soon. Okay, I went long, I guess. I don't know if I'm going to be able to get to questions then.
You know, I want to point out, Joe, that one thing that you said in your slide, you called out Republicans as the villain. And in this last slide, I would remind our members, because of our nonpartisan position, that a handful of politicians is a much stronger phrasing than calling out the party. And that will always work for us.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right.